What's going on, guys? Super Tuesday. Pumped to be in the studio tonight. Got a monster for you. Man, 2019 starting off with a bang, like a rocket, like a slingshot, and the trajectory of the rock is just right there. Mirai team back in full effect. This is actually our first full week back, and we're 2 days into it. And it feels like we've been away from this for years.
He's not wrong,
really,
folks.
It's really weird, right?
It's very weird.
It's a strange thing. Mirai time, the vortex. We call this place the vortex. Time, gone, vanishes. Anyways, excited to dig into the Cascade style with you guys tonight. An often highly abused, highly abused style. Very dramatic, very powerful, but we've got to have the right elements in place, and then the discussion of how do we implement design in the cascading style. Got Sam on the mic this evening.
Hey, everybody.
Josh producing the stream. Got Eve on the detail. Hello. Jesus to my right. T-Roy is joining us in studio, although he is not mic'd. His presence will be felt, and we've got our Jedi Knight up managing audio in the mothership. When we say that cascading form is one of the most abused forms, generally when you see the cascading form chosen in bonsai, it's sort of this real kind of pigeon-breasted curve, sort of nothing going on. We're like, what do we do with this tree? Let's make it a cascade. This is the general sort of fallback. I don't have any other answers. I'm going to make it a cascade. And all of us have done it. I'm totally guilty. And inside of that, it was a tree that I didn't like before it started, I didn't like after it was a cascade, and I never grew to like it in its evolution beyond sort of that decision because it wasn't the right choice for the material. So, having said that, we start to look at, okay, all right, so we abuse this form a little bit. I call the cascading design decision sort of the round pot. If we were to refer to ceramics, how much we abuse the round ceramic, it's like the round pot of bonsai design. It's the fallback, it's the sort of available choice, that or the windswept form, and both of those really are special, dramatic, very specific designs. So, what does it take to make a really fantastic cascade design? And the answer is, it takes this sharp angle of drop, right? Less than 45 degrees, a very acute angle of drop. That sets us up to be able to formulate that really dramatic sort of search and quest for light, dictated movement by the elements, starting to seek out some sort of availability, or it's pushed in that direction for whatever reason. Cascading form is a monumental stylistic decision that we make, and we've got to be able to respond to that acute angle of drop and choose that design. Now, everybody has access to the design stream now. This is, the design stream sets the tone for everything that we do. And when we get into the cascading form, this idea of the trunk moving in this direction, right? And then how do we handle the defining branch and the movement of the apex is a big question that we have to ask ourselves in bonsai design. But when we get into the cascading form, it almost feels like, okay, the trunk is dropping to the right, so that means the branch has to move to the right and the apex has to move to the right, and this is not necessarily true. So tonight, diving into the cascading form, but also attacking the cascading form from what does a tension design applied to the cascading form start to create? How do we feel about that? Is it the best decision? How do we utilize that and execute that well? This is the focus of tonight's stream. Now, this tree, there's an image of this in the gallery on bonsaimirai.com when it was much smaller and much less developed. Obviously, it's gotten quite large, so large that the foliar mass is now out of proportion to the rest of the tree. So we've actually gone around sort of the cyclical phase of development where we maximize that first design. We've got to come back now and we've got to look at this tree in terms of, do we still like that tension-filled design as it's applied to a cascade, which is a little bit of a unique design approach to the cascading form, right? And inside of that, if we still enjoy the tension-filled design in the cascading form, how do we regain the proportions of this tree to maximize the visual interest and quality and make this trunk feel as significant as it does in the studio image that exists on bonsaimirai.com? So I'm just just gonna step up to where you guys are now. We're looking at this tree in reference to these two holes here, the foot being centered and the front for you guys. And what we see is this movement of this cascading branch back. Justification for bringing that branch back always has to fall back on information being derived from the material. The material is what leads the dance in our design process at Mirai. And as we look at this, we notice that although we have living tissue here, a majority of the base that represents that point of stability on the left side of this tree is deadwood. And the actual living tissue and the living vein is behind it. Now, we talk about choosing those designs from how much of this base do we have the point of stability to be able to anchor that asymmetry and that big push to the right if in fact this tree is cascading to the right in terms of direction of the trunk. And when we started to see that in all actuality there's a lot of mass over here on the right side of the base, we don't have necessarily that living vein or that extending root that's gripping the ground and giving us that visual anchor to push to the right. What happens if we start to pull this back to the left, redistribute that visual mass back to the left so that we compensate for that lack of anchor on the left side of the base of the tree and pull in that tension as it applies to cascade? And I'm going to say, just kind of reorienting, because I haven't looked at this tree a lot in a long time. I've known it's needed to be reworked. I know that it's overgrown its proportion, but I haven't spent a tremendous amount of time with it. But I'm going to say the decisions around the design are still very sound in terms of bringing that visual weight back, now seeing that base. And you can see the dark spot on the base. There was a big chunk of moss growing on it, and I just pulled it off, so it's still a little wet. But that's all really solid deadwood right there. And I'm going to say that sticking with this design feels appropriate, but obviously this weight is way too overbearing in terms of what's happened in this cascading branch compared to the size and girth of the trunk. And we know we need to come back and revamp a design on a bonsai when the foliar mass has outgrown the proportions of the trunk that give it that appearance of balance and stability. It feels too heavy down in here, okay? So I've been kind of looking at this branch. Now, Jesus, go ahead and zoom in here on this lowest branch, just so we can kind of see the fruits of our labors. And I say fruits of our labors because we say, listen, in this long needle single flush growth habit, our first priority is to allow enough needle mass on the tips of the branches to accumulate to be able to build the vascular tissue that gives us back buds. And we've got to continue to build the strength of those tips to be able to drive those back buds to actual needle mass. And what we see when we start to look past this big bushy tip and we pull it out of the way, we start to see that we've cultivated a tremendous amount of ramification and finer branching on the interior of the tree. That automatically is starting in my mind to formulate, oh, I can reduce some of this visual mass and cut back to some of that area. Now, what we've also got, if we just kind of take a little peekaboo in here and look at this lowest branch, is we recognize that we've got several branches that are extremely long and kind of drawn out without a lot of interior growth because the formation of that bark on that branch probably impaired the development of finer branching to actually back bud and form. So we might need to take a look at an interchange of that longest lowest branch, shifting form, maybe starting to utilize some of this interior growth. And from that point, let's dive into the design and really set that defining branch structure. Okay, so I'm going to elevate this just a little bit to be able to better access this. Make sure it doesn't get too tippy on me.
Famous double turntable.
The double turn, the doble turntable. And I'm just going to take off some of the structural wire that's occurred here. If anybody has any questions, Sam, while I kind of minimizes the last wired piece on this tree.
I'll let you know. We're all just chatting away. No questions yet.
Chatting away. Just getting caught up, right? Everybody's back from the new year. I love Knipex. Making the shift to Knipex was literally like a life-transforming choice, wasn't it, Troy?
Sponsored by Knipex.
Sponsored.
Just kidding. It's not sponsored.
This infomercial, well, if we were sponsored by Knipex, I wouldn't complain. I'm pretty sure they're...
I'll get working on that.
Yeah, Sam, if you could, do a little something.
I'll get right on it.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by eliminating a few of these just really long, sort of overly grown pieces. Now, again, when I start to look at what the strength of these tips is giving me underneath, I see a lot of really weak branches, elongated branches that are contributing to the mass but not necessarily contributing to the shape of the tree. And we're always talking about, in this quest for design, where is our defining branch going to occur? Now, when we look at this branch is kind of our lowest branch, but it's not our defining branch. Our defining branch is sitting off here, giving us that big push, that asymmetrical push to the left side of this design. And when I look at the fact that this is super long, we're talking about a tree that's overgrown its proportions, one of the things that interests me is what happens if we go ahead and get rid of this longest branch? And I'm curious what you guys think about that. Does this branch go in this redesign with the knowledge that we've got so many finer branches? And let me just show you guys this from the front view. So many finer branches cultivated in here, and even really fine ramification out on this tip where I can start to decrease that length and control that mass. I'm going to say this probably needs to be a piece that comes off just in the analysis of design, but I want to be sure because I don't get to put this back on, obviously.
You've got a agreement in the chat about
agreement. It's got to go.
Let it go. Yeah.
Let it
go.
Fly free.
Let it go.
Fly free, branch. Fly free.
David wants to know where the front of this tree is.
So we're going to orient again from the front. This central foot right between these two cutouts, right here and right here. So our front is right in this area here. Thought I might have a piece of chalk. I don't have it on my turntable. Troy might be able to help me out with that. We'll mark it so that we can use it as a reference because it does get a little lost. Okay, and I'm going to take this piece off, but I'm going to take this piece off, leaving myself a little bit of a remnant, so that I can have that sort of indication that there was at one time a branch there. It'll be a short, stubby gin, totally into that sort of remnant of what was when we come back to this revamp style, because we've grown all these branches, we've gotten that woody structure to exist and occur, and all of a sudden, as we start to reduce and we start to revamp, we need to show that that was there. That's a big part of aging design. When we remove those whole branches, we pull those pieces out, we leave something in their place to show that they existed. And that remnant, that gin, that deadwood, that's a big part of bonsai design as your trees continue to evolve. How do we reduce this mass? We don't want to come back on every tip and prune every tip back and try to get back to where the tree was. This is not a conscious thought in our mind to try and regain what once was. We're going to try to readdress the proportion to maximize the visibility of the trunk, but we want to move the tree forward, keep carrying it down the line. Now, when we're talking about moving it forward, how are we going to move it forward? What line are we moving it forward on? The line and the concept of age. This is where we're evolving and starting to progress our trees in this whole system of bonsai design. Now, I said I want to push this back. It still feels a little long. I'm going to go ahead and take off some of these stronger tips, and this is also a nuance of long needle single flush pines. Jesus, go ahead and focus in here for me. Okay, when we take that back, with long needle single flush pines, because of the length of their needles, and this has a relatively, let's see what we got here, T-Roy. Thank you, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. I looked away before I grabbed it. That's the biggest faux pas of a shortstop.
We got a couple design ideas. Would you like to hear about them?
I would. Let me just go ahead and kind of lock everybody in here to the front. That'll be a good reference. Okay, somewhere in there is going to be the front of our tree, just so we see that T for T-Roy right there, right on the front. Okay. Yeah, let's hear the ideas.
Yeah. So, and we've got some questions I'll get to as well. So Wayne says if you get rid of the top tuft and rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, that'd be a pretty strong line. And Bill is saying it feels like the right side foliage needs to be reduced.
Definitely, definitely. So every action has an equal and sort of responsive reaction. So as I start to reduce this left side and push back, I've got to carry the same thematic all the way through the tree, right? I can't just reduce a few branches here and be like, there you go, we redesigned our bonsai. You know, this has to be sort of a tree-wide holistic approach to a bonsai redesign. But I want to come back to what I was saying before. And again, coming back to this, if we can see that, Josh, on the close-up. So with a long needle single flush pine, because we do have fairly elongated needles, and we were talking about the fact that that length of needle creates a significant amount of photosynthetic mass, we can actually cut back to smaller shoots and smaller buds than we would typically cut back to on a multi-flush or a single flush tree. Now, I'm not saying go back into all your long needle single flush, and reduce those heavily, because we know the repercussion of a heavy reduction is going to be a slightly elongated needle. Now, this tree has been in this container for, this will be the 6th year starting this spring that it's in this container. In order to get those longer needles to reduce, we've got to fill up this container with roots and really compress the amount of available resources pines store in their roots and distribute to all of these needles. But we said the timing for that, if you go back and you refer to long needle single flush pine stream where we did the ponderosa on the rock, we have to do that at a point where that tree hasn't used this needle mass to accumulate all of its energy over the fall to produce growth that following spring. Obviously, doing this work right now at the beginning of January, all of the energy is already in the tree. So we know that we're going to suffer a little bit of needle elongation by timing this work right now. I'm willing to accept that because of the fact that if I continue to let this tree accumulate more and more foliage, the interior branches that we've cultivated are going to get weaker and weaker by that presence of auxin, that hormone in the tip that suppresses the growth of the interior shoots, right? And also by the fact that those tips are getting so long, they're overgrowing a lot of these interior branches, pulling those out, transitioning that priority by removing that auxin and opening that up to sunlight. If I get longer needles, I'm gonna get longer needles on the smaller shoots, boost their strength, and start to create the framework for that next second iteration of this tree's shape. I'm okay with that. Would I have ideally liked to have done this in September when it was dropping its 3rd year needles? That's the indication for our long needle single flush pine of when we can go back and reduce the foliage and have a minimal impact on needle length. Yes, I would have. Did we get it done? Clearly we didn't, so now we're here doing it now and we know what the repercussions are going to be.
All right, so Rafi actually had a question that dealt with needle size. So his question was, the manner of treating ponderosa that you describe is to fertilize a lot, to have a lot of foliage, and that will lead to decreasing needle size.
This is true.
So why, with such a large mass of foliage on this tree, are the needles so long?
Yeah, well, so then the question is, proportionally to the standard growth habit of ponderosa pine, are the needles actually that long? And I'm actually going to say, when we look at the length, let's just go ahead and objectively look at the length of last year's needles in regards to this tree. This is probably a 2.5-inch needle. As far as a ponderosa pine is concerned, where you can get 6 and 7-inch needles, is a 2.5-inch needle really that long? In all actuality, it's not. And so what we're saying when we say fertilize aggressively, in the first 3 years, while you're building that tree's strength, coming out of collection, push that needle length, push that photosynthetic mass. That generates the vascular tissue that gives you backbudding, and eventually that backbudding is what gives you expanded needle mass, and that expanded needle mass is what dilutes the amount of stored energy that that pine has in its roots. Pine's strength comes from its roots. What does that mean? They store a tremendous amount of energy in that vascular tissue that exists in the roots. The roots are very coarse. This is why they lean on microbial activity, that symbiotic relationship to the fungi in the soil, fungi expanding the surface area of the root mass because the roots are coarse, but they have excessive sugars and starches in that storage organ. Fungi increase surface area to pull in water and nutrition. Tree gives fungi sugars and starches, and they coexist beautifully. And we see this in the relationship that is mycorrhiza, right? So it is true for the first 3 years we fertilize aggressively. Once we get that interior growth to occur, we want to pull back on spring fertilization, and we won't fertilize our long needle single flush until the needles have hardened off. Now, when we talk about that, we say Pinus parviflora, Japanese white pine, long needle single flush, Pinus flexilis, Pinus strobus, right? 5-needle pines that are long needle single flush pines if we fertilize aggressively in the spring. Once we build up that backbudding and that needle count, we pull back on that fertilization. Now, the difference between timing for a ponderosa versus timing for a limber pine, a Japanese white pine, or a Pinus strobus, an eastern white pine, is the idea that a white pine hardens off much earlier in the season. They're done elongating in June, and we know this because they shed their sheaths, which we've seen and shown on the live stream, okay? That's our indication for work. For a ponderosa, we know they're done elongating when they shed their third-year needles. And what we see is ponderosa pine elongate all the way through the summer into the early fall. We see that needle shed in the northern hemisphere happening typically second week of September. That's our indication when it starts to shed its third-year needles that it is done elongating. We can only start fertilizing on our more refined trees from that point forward, or else we will perpetuate the elongated needle.
Can we get a 360 on this tree? We've got lots of
360.
questions about that.
Sorry.
We just got too excited.
Yeah, well, so I've been looking at this tree for 2 years, like, time to go back in and revamp, let's figure it out. So I just kind of dove in. Yeah, and there's a really interesting feature here. This root had to be sandwiched to the tree to put it into this pot as a cascading form. That wire that was pulling those together has been removed. The tension that was in that root to sandwich them, which was a significant amount of force to sandwich this system together, is now gone. It's no longer necessary. The tissue has grown enough. So we see an interesting feature on the right side of the tree in terms of this root that's protruding, resting right on the edge. It's got this beautiful shari, this beautiful piece of deadwood on the end. All of this tree's roots are attached to this. There's no roots at the base of this tree.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Speaking of that, David asked, was the twisty big bend at the top natural, or was that created?
Totally
Okay.
natural. Totally natural, and actually the piece that told us, hey, how about a cascade? What do you think about a cascading form? Looks like I'm kind of tailor-made to cascade. And we were like, yeah, okay. That acute angle of drop is what pushed us in the direction to pursue this design, risk that big root bend, do all of the things that we've done to handle this tree aesthetically. Okay? Now, as I'm reducing the length of this, I'm also cleaning up the bottom of these branches. When we talk about distributing the energy and really balancing out the strength of our long needle single flush pine, we do so by the pruning that you're seeing here. Because they are genetically adapted to be behaving and functioning in an area where there's very limited moisture. When we look at all of our single flush long needle pine, hot, dry, rocky, south-facing slopes, usually in an elevated region, although if we look at the Pinus strobus, we see strobus occurring at the coastline the farther north we go, right? So when we start to look at that, this is a tree that's genetically adapted to not have a lot of water. We reflect that in terms of our soil composition. This is a more oxygen heavy, so we pull the 1/16 out of the soil composition. 111, Akadama lava pumice. 1/16 comes out, so we've got 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch particle size to open up the air spaces and provide that oxygen. We're very careful about the way we water. We don't excessively water these species, single flush long needle pine. It will increase needle length, but beyond that, the tree needs more oxygen than water. We allow them to thoroughly dry out before we hydrate them again. And this is a big sort of crux of where we see failure in a lot of the imported Japanese white pines. We tend to overwater them, treat them like a black pine, treat them like pines that are more water loving, and that's not how they behave, right? But in addition to that, just coming back to dry, south-facing, rocky hillsides, very little moisture. When we talk about strength of balancing energy, I'm not plucking needles like a black pine to balance the energy on this tree. As we see the tips get stronger and stronger, and we get to that point where that crown overgrows the proportion that gives that trunk and the features of the tree value, we come back and we heavily reduce that strength in the tip back to those interior branches, really pull on everything we've created by fertilizing over the first 3 years out of the mountains with these trees, and use those shoots that have grown on the interior to become our next branch. But in that transition, the strong tip comes off. We replace that with a little bit slightly less coarse, less vigorous, interior, finer ramification, and that transition is what allows us to close down that design. So this is important to understand when we come back to a long needle single flush pine that's outgrown its proportions. So let's just kind of take a look. There was a comment that we needed to reduce over here. I took this strong tip out of that piece. Let me get back to the front so we can kind of see, and already we can see that just by reducing that, now the trunk is really starting to become quite prominent again, a little bit more magical. We see that proportion. It looks a little bit grander with the reduction of some of that mass and length. This is exactly what we were after, and we've cultivated the interior branches to be able to access this kind of design concept. We clearly need to reduce a little bit more on the right side because now in the reduction of the left side, we've created a bit of symmetry. So let's kind of shift over to that right side and just work through cleaning up those bottom needles so that we have a nice defined bottom of our branch pad, not plucking to distribute strength again. I want to be very clear about that. I'm only doing it aesthetically so that all of these bottom hanging needles, what we see here, hanging below the bottom of that branch come off, and it gives us that clean definition pad to pad between our branch pads.
So Stephen wanted to know, how long has this tree taken to overgrow its silhouette and trunk?
That's a great question. So it's taken, and what we see with our single flush long needle pines, because they are slower growing, based on that adaptation and their general genetic propensity to not necessarily grow rapidly and not necessarily move a lot of water through their system. This tree was designed, so this will be its 6th year in a container. It was designed outside of the container the year prior. It's taken 7 years to get it to the point where we come back and revamp this design. And if you guys remember, we did that revamp of the Literati ponderosa pine. What was that, a month? 2 months, 6 weeks ago?
Yeah.
Right, that also was in its 6th year of aesthetic development, and we only then were just getting to a point where we had cultivated the interior branches. It was too dense to execute the design, and we had to come back in and readdress the reduction to regain that proportion that was appropriate for Literati, right? And that tree is doing great. It's in the greenhouse after that heavy reduction. We're not letting it freeze, not letting it get excessive rain here in the Pacific Northwest. This tree, depending on how far we go with it, we may need to greenhouse it, but the idea is that we don't greenhouse it, that we go just far enough to execute the aesthetic, but that it can go back out on the benches. We'll see what the final product is and make a judgment call at that point. Okay, now when I'm plucking these needles, one thing that we need to be very, very careful about with long needle single flush pines, and this is true for Pinus parviflora, this is true for Pinus flexilis, this is true for Pinus strobus. We need to be very careful, and again, I'm going to start to reduce these tips over here, so I'm going to take out some of that length. We need to be very careful that we don't pull too many needles at once, because the bark on these, because of the coarseness of the branch and the coarseness of the junction, that allows that connection of hydration to keep these bigger needles hydrated. There's a stronger vascular connection, there's a greater amount of xylem and a greater amount of phloem that's connected. If we pull too many needles off at once, we'll pull the bark off with it. So as I'm needle plucking, you guys are probably seeing that it's a little bit of slow going, because I'm literally going one pair, all right, and this is a 2-needle pine, 1 pair of needles at a time, just so that I don't tear that bark and cause any more damage to the tree than is absolutely necessary in this redesign and this scope of work, okay? And I'm going to continue to sort of push. I even have buds. Jesus, can you show that really nice bud right there? Okay, I even have these tiny little buds on the inside, and they are pretty much everywhere across this tree. With this reduction of this tip, this bud is going to be encouraged to start to stimulate and grow. I've got a much finer piece back in here. I still leave myself enough needle mass to draw that water, that transpiration through this branch to make sure that that gets enough priority to grow. But if I'd left that strong tip on, there's a chance that this is going to get shaded out and not perform in the way that we hope it would. Okay, so that starts to reduce this side, which again starts to push that design into that more tension aesthetic that we're looking for. Now I'm going to come up into the midsection here, and I've got quite a few very big long branches. We've got to make a decision. Do we keep these branches, or do we start to eliminate these branches? And this is where in design we have to understand that we've got to connect. We've got this lower foliar mass that exists off of this big defining branch. We've got this midsection that's kind of bare of branches, right? And then we've got this upper canopy. Now we have some stuff in the back that can fill in this midsection. We've also got some finer branches over here. Do we still need this big, long, dangling branch that actually comes from the apical region to cover that line so that we don't get full disclosure and start to sever that connection of these bottom branches to that upper canopy of the tree? These are where we have to really step back and make sound decisions. So be thinking about that as I'm working through it, and just sort of formulate your own opinions and decisions about that, because we may need it. And if we're going to be moving this apex over to the left side to work with this, we may choose to leave this strong tip and the length on this upper apical region to get that apex further moved over to the left. We've got to decide on that as well, and this will come as we work through this midsection of the tree.
Eric had a pine question that deals with repotting, but I think it's related. But in terms of reduction, so he says, when repotting a pine into its first bonsai pot, is it still good to leave lots of foliage to feed the root recovery,
Absolutely.
like junipers?
Absolutely, yeah. And we talk about this with junipers specifically because strength in junipers definitively comes from the foliage mass, right? And junipers lean on that foliage mass a lot more heavily than other species typically tend to lean on it for. But when we think about the system that allows a tree to generate energy, the only thing that any tree, deciduous, conifer, juniper, pine, maple, the only energy production, the food that the tree generates for itself is the photosynthetic product, which is sugars and starches. And so if we're overly reducing the leaf mass and then we're telling a tree, okay tree, we just reduced your only way to feed yourself and accumulate the kind of energy that you need to respond to this positively, if we're doing so and then we're telling it to respond by heavily pruning it, there's no way that it can generate new roots. There's no way it can generate vascular tissue in the trunk. And this is where we've seen to date in a lot of our long needle pines trying to needle pluck to balance energy, reducing the foliage mass to balance energy, and it doesn't work for us. The needles become excessively long as a result of that approach, not understanding that this is not a Japanese black pine. We don't decandle this tree. It can't produce a second flush of growth in the same season. It's not a multi-flush. It's a single flush. It definitely has a propensity to produce a longer needle. As a result, we have to apply different methodology to the way that we handle the growth in this tree. And that methodology is allowing the needle mass to accumulate, to distribute the stored energy that exists in the root system of the tree, which is very effective. And instead of trying to stress the tree, instead of trying to sort of debilitate it to reduce its needle length, this is really building the tree and working with the tree to give it the resources it needs to expand its mass and distribute its stored energy. And that has been a major, major breakthrough. And this breakthrough was totally catalyzed. Got to give credit where credit's due. Walter Paul, dealing with, for a while, Walter could import ponderosa pine and Rocky Mountain juniper to Germany. It's no longer possible in Europe to do so. And when he was in Germany, he was achieving very short needles. And this is back when I'm in college. This is like 2000 to 2004. I was a voracious consumer of his blog and looking at the work that he was doing. And he was saying, everybody says don't water your ponderosa pine. Everybody says don't fertilize them. Everybody says starve them. And he said, what do I do to get short needles? I fertilize the crap out of them. I water the crap out of them. And over the course of time, they backbud profusely and get shorter needles. I didn't create this system. I just observed it, and then coming back from Japan and everybody's saying ponderosa pine can never be good bonsai, I started saying, is that true? Because Japanese white pine inherently has long needles, and yet that seems to be something that everybody's pretty stoked on. How do we get the ponderosa pine to maximize its behavior as a bonsai? Needle reduction being catalyzed by the increase of the photosynthetic surface area, really using that to generate backbudding, which they were typically thought to not backbud well. They backbud profusely, FYI. And all of a sudden, voila, we've got this magical system that we're starting to bring to fruition and is really giving us a leg up in terms of using this wonderful material to keep it native, to enjoy the ponderosa pine, because these needles do make it feel wild. It does feel very natural. It has a character to them with the needles that some people don't necessarily prefer if the model we're referring to is the Japanese model. But if we're sort of a little bit more open-minded, we adapt our design decisions and we handle these physiologically and horticulturally accurate, then we can get these to give us really nice short needles, and it's quite beautiful what becomes of it.
So we've got a couple design thoughts as you're getting into that part of the tree. So Leonard says the right side branches appear leggy. Could they be wired to a better use rather than removing them?
Oh, for sure. For sure, yeah, all of these have to be. And again, this tree was unwired. The wire was digging in pretty heavily because of the growth with the expansion of the needle mass. It was unwired this summer. We had planned to get to it in September. It never happened. Perfect opportunity to execute a design stream and a ponderosa stream on the cascading form. And so now we've got to decide how much of these leggy branches do we want to keep. And I'm going to say that we're going to try to, as much as we possibly can, we're going to try to create some space. We're going to try to create a little bit more visibility of the trunk that's been lost in this whole growth and excessive incremental increase of health. And in doing so, we can get rid of some of the length, but we're definitely going to keep these over here, and we're definitely going to have to wire them to make sure that they continue to stay strong and keep pace with the rest of the tree that's already growing very upright.
And then Tom was wondering about a front. He asked, why not rotate it a little bit counterclockwise where you could see a little bit more trunk? He just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is the farther towards the counterclockwise that we go, the more of that space and the wider that angle becomes. And we said, listen, one of the things about cascading form, when we have a tree that's true blue cascade and is executing cascade to the maximum potential, we want that really acute angle of drop. So as I use that idea of foreshortening and I take that real visibility, let me go here, and I start to rotate it this way, we see a much sharper angle of drop. And this is just that foreground, background, closing of that space. I think you see a better vision of the base. I think you see that elbow as a more prominent design feature, but that space being closed down, really important aspect of this tree being a quality cascade. So I don't think that you're wrong, Tom, and there are other trees where that would be a good decision. I think for this one to continue to maximize the cascading form, we kind of nailed it right off the bat, and that was a real big consideration because there's so much interest in this tree. Kind of trying to choose that front that we were going to settle on for the design, that was a big part of that decision-making process, okay? So we're starting to get that closed down. You can start to see how we're pushing in here. If we consider probably going to need this branch right here, I believe. If we take it off, we're going to be leaning, The thing about taking this branch off right here is if we take it off, these branches are the same length as the apex. Feels like they might be left out. This is one that we're still not sure about, so we're going to leave it. Okay, as I come over here to this side, now we're going to be utilizing these around the back. And one of the challenging things about Cascade, notice how weak these branches are that are on the back side. I mean, this tree is sitting on a bench. These branches are always constantly up against the bench and not receiving a ton of sunlight, but they're imperative for the design of this tree because they give our foliar mass depth. We've got to work harder in the next 2 years maybe to get these boosted up with strength, but there's not a possibility to remove these. These are necessary for that depth. So we'll have to see how we can try to get those in a better position. But just to understand that this is important, and then as we rotate around so that you guys can see here, this piece is one of those big depth pieces that shows on the other side of that defining branch, a very significant branch as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave those. I'm not going to remove. They don't have the same needle mass. They don't have the same quantity of drooping needles. I might just take a few of the really droopy ones off, but for the most part, we're going to keep these pumped up with needle mass. And in the reduction of a lot of these strong tips, these will gain a little bit of priority in the whole process of this redesign. Go ahead.
I've got some questions.
Go ahead.
So Earl wanted to know how the root bend on this tree was accomplished. Was it a wedge cut?
So this tree actually, and Ponderosa being flexible as a general species sort of characteristic, and that's not always universal. We just encountered one of the best Ponderosa at Mirai in the workshop while Todd was here, and it was definitely not flexible. Occasionally you'll find those trees that don't have a lot of resin in their core, or that have a lot of rot, or a lot of presence of brittleness in the shape and in the structure of the wood. And but for this tree, it was very flexible. So just sandwiching those two together without doing any major sort of wedge cuts or invasive bending procedures, we were able to close the gap, and it was enough. It was enough just with the simple flexibility and malleability of the tissue, and mainly because that junction where they join is out here on this elbow, where this bark rolls over here, we had a great distance upon which that bend could occur, and we could allow a lot of tissue to take up the stress of that bend. But this root originally was sticking straight out the back, and we folded it all the way to the front and actually folded it up. And you'll notice that it's resting right on the rim of the container because we needed to get that base to the elevation that was slightly above the rim of the container, a very standard approach to handling a cascading form. You'll notice that it's mounded up a little bit. This is intentional. It wasn't necessary, it was intentional. We want that cascading form to sit up a little bit, mound it up, and drop down with that acute angle. This is the aesthetic that maximizes this sort of form of the cascade.
So we've got some other design thoughts. So Andrew thinks you should keep the movement to the right as if it's clinging to a southern facing cliff, and remove the foliage at the bottom that comes back toward the left and continue the long, beautiful line to the right.
Over here.
Yes.
Yeah, and so when we look at this and you look at sort of the structure and the value of your tree, okay? We have this tremendously beautiful branch filled with movement, filled with changes of angle and direction. To cut this off and replace it with a lot of these really long dangly branches that all originate from up here in the apical region, that's might be more detrimental than good. Even if we say, listen, I've never seen a cascade in a tension design, it makes me a little uncomfortable. This is where we back into the idea of design and this tree having the potential based on the information of the base. We don't have the base there to anchor this movement to the right. We can't elongate out here and not have this over here countering that length. So if we're going to have that, and we've got all of that quality through that portion of the branching, and structurally, this is actually a very valuable piece because all of these other pieces occur from one junction up at the top of the tree. It's imperative that we figure out a way to use this. And the way to pull that in with the information of the base is the tension design. So as much as I feel, right, and my natural inclination in Cascade is to go with harmony and continue moving out this way. This tree, every single aspect, the tree leads the dance. We don't apply what we know and are comfortable with. We apply what the material is offering us the opportunity to create. We see that the tension design and the cascading form, although not often practiced, is a very interesting and unique design decision, but it's being guided by the material itself.
Yeah, we've got opposing thoughts. Rafi thinks you should remove everything that goes to the right, keep the asymmetry to the maximum on the left. Christopher agrees, would keep the foliage going to the left at the very bottom and even lower down the bottom left branch even more to make it seem like it comes back under the base of the trunk.
Totally. So we're going to have to re-guide that. Since we took that big long piece off of the front, we're going to have to kind of reform that branch that's defining the movement. And I think it is going to have to be lower. And I think because of the quality of the line through this structure, we are going to have to expose some of that. And that's really where, when we start to look at a revamp like this, we've spent a lot of time with this tree evolving this design decision. It doesn't mean we're bound to the design that we've been building, but it does mean that we need to go back and kind of refer to why did we choose this? And this is why it's so important to have strategy around your design process, because if we come back and we look at a tree and we say, gosh, why did I choose that? And we can't touch base with that moment where we had that inspiration, we end up changing trees dramatically for no reason except for we're just at another moment where we're like, well, I got to do something else. And this a lot of times is when we make moves that we later regret in a tree. And I'm sure we've all had it, I've definitely had it, where I cut something off and after I cut it off, you get like that feeling of shock, like that surge of kind of adrenaline and you're like, oh, I did that. That just happened and I can't have that back. And that was definitely the wrong move, right? We want to try to prevent that as much as we possibly can in bonsai design. That there may not be a more uncomfortable feeling in the creation of bonsai than lopping off something in that big, bold moment that we have and then going back and being like, well, that tree is not nearly what it used to be. And again, I say that from just a tremendous amount of experience making that mistake. You know, you're emboldened to make a design decision. This tree is overgrown, I got to reduce it. Do so with a calculated analysis, knowing that you designed the tree with a firm grounding and understanding of the design when you made the initial decisions, and you start to be able to reason through your design decisions more accurately.
So I want to go back to a question really quick just to clarify, but I can wait until after you're done with this if you'd like.
Okay, so the length on the right side, we're still unsure about it. We don't want to open up all of the negative space on the right side because we would show the bringing back of the apex. That apex was circled back up and around, right? We don't want to necessarily expose this full length of it, that's more of a literati design decision to show so much of the trunk. But we definitely see a lot more than we were seeing initially. We do want to see this movement of this defining branch. So these are serving a function. When we wire them up, we're going to be able to make length decisions. I'm going to start setting the structure down here and seeing if we can really create that definition and that stylistic approach to the pads. I'll answer some of your guys' questions, and then we can reassess design as we start to formulate this portion of the tree. Always we start with the structure of the tree, and in the structure, the defining branch is our starting point for the execution of design.
So I wanted to clarify a question. So Eric had asked a question about if getting ready for repotting and root work, if leaving a lot of foliage was important.
Yes.
And he just wanted to clarify that it's a Japanese black pine. Does that all that still stand for that?
Stands,
Okay.
definitely stands. Every tree, when we prepare for repotting, you know, and there's a cutoff to this though, right? Because we can say that, and then you guys might see me do the work on a tree. And like, for example, the Percummins juniper last week, right? One of the questions was the angle change of that design. Are you going to still repot? And the answer was, well, we have a tree here that's been already, it had minimal amount of branches. We grew it out into a bush. We refined it, but it has more foliage than it used to when we did that first repot. We let that thing get robust, okay? Now that I've got all these interior branches on this tree, and if we're dealing with a tree that already has been developed as a bonsai for quite some time, can we come in and address a redesign, but still have a lot of foliage left on the tree even though we redesigned it and safely repot? We absolutely can. So there's a big difference between saying, okay, in order for this tree to be successful being repotted, we've got to build up a ton of needle mass, and that means we can't touch it, and the tree's already overgrown, and we're like, gosh, I kind of need to do a little bit of both. How do I handle that? I would have no problem repotting this tree with the current foliage mass on it, having removed what I've removed. And I've removed quite a lot, but there's still a lot on the tree. Particularly when we're talking about a tree that's just beginning its journey as a bonsai, a first repot out of mountain soil, a major angle change where we're going to impact the roots. We want it to have all the resources it can possibly have, whether it's a pine, whether it's a juniper, whether it's a spruce, whether it's a fir. We want it to have resources to generate that root system. Once we start to get more interior ramification, more needle mass accumulated, it doesn't necessarily have as significant of an impact on the tree to go back in and do root work, because the root work is going to be far less invasive. We've already tackled a lot of the native soil circumstances that exist, and we're going to be making more minimal changes, just the same as in the reshaping of the tree. The reshaping of the roots are going to be far more minimal and far more realistic for the tree to recover from on an established tree with this much interior ramification. So you have to answer that based on what stage is that tree that you're talking about and asking that question in regards to be able to answer, is it going to be safe, or should I accumulate enough needle mass? And I will say this, if it's a field-grown black pine, it's best to utilize every single needle on that black pine for the first repot from a collected container or a growing container out of the field into a bonsai pot. Best to not style it at all. You'll have the highest level of success with that needle mass. The more needles you remove off of a tree that has a dramatic amount of root work to be done, the greater you're going to compromise its ability to recover. And we've actually found that we'll style our collected trees after they've recovered from the collection process in the grow box. We'll let them grow for a year and amass a tremendous amount of foliage mass. We'll go in and repot them without even touching the shape of that tree, just leaving all those needles. That's how we get them to reestablish. On a tree out of the field, we don't even style them. We just go ahead and use all of the needle mass possible after they've recovered from collection from the field to get them into a bonsai pot first, and then we start the styling process after they've recovered. So field grown versus collected, we've even developed a little bit of a different strategy about how we go about the order of operations to handle that tree effectively. And we've done so based on our experiences of having failed a lot with field-grown trees, trying to treat them by styling them first as if it were a collected tree, and it hasn't gone well for us. We've had a high level of attrition. We've learned don't touch that tree until its root system is really rebuilt in a much more aggregate soil, or you're gonna have a hard time in that first repot.
So Hulk wants to know, isn't it better, and this is when you were removing needles, isn't it better to cut at the base of the needles? Is there any difference to plucking or cutting?
So when you cut at the base of the needles, you get a tremendously larger amount of sap leaking out of the tree. It looks horrifically unsightly, but it does minimize the potential to tear the bark. And there are some people that abide by the idea of cutting as opposed to plucking. I've always plucked, but I've plucked with a tremendous amount of sensitivity to that potential to tear. I think the aesthetic is better. I think you have a lot more contact with that very fresh tissue that exists at those bundles at the tip, and I think that tends to give you a lot more room and better back budding when you pluck as opposed to cut. But again, if it's a question of, or if the tree is showing a sensitivity to the reduction of those needles via plucking and you're getting torn bark, you can absolutely go ahead and cut. Absolutely you can.
And then Leonard, he was asking about wiring out those kind of leggy branches. When you do wire those leggy branches, do you have to let the wire scar to give it a better set?
If you don't let them grow, and this is where we have to understand the dynamics of wire scarring, right? What causes wire to dig in to the branch? The branch has to expand. The branch has to grow and it has to thicken. And so when we start to think about, do we let the wire scar? Well, we do need that branch to grow in order to set the position that we've chosen for that branch. And so oftentimes I say, yes, let the wire scar. But when I say let the wire scar, we have to understand that the scarring is just an indication that we've gotten enough vascular productivity for that branch to have a much higher likelihood that it's going to hold that shape on the actual tree, and so that's my indication. And the other thing when we talk about scarring is, I'm not telling you guys in any way, shape, or form that you should allow your maples to scar or your beech to scar. Any smooth bark species of tree, if it scars, you're never gonna get rid of that scar. Whereas on a pine, the accumulation of this cork cambium, the bark as we know it, allows us to cover up or heal over those scars so that they're not a visible part of the tree over the course of time. This tree had tremendous wire scars on these branches in the middle of the summer. And when you look in here at these, although you can see some shadowy remnants, can you see that, Jesus? Okay, right there, there's some callus that's forming where this was deeply scarred. And from the summer till now, over the fall season, that deep scar has already started to heal over. In another year, you're not going to see it. And that's what allows us to say it's okay with this tree to be able to do that to set the branches.
And then Andy wanted to know, as you're removing branches there, are you cutting at a bud or just at a shorter length? And will a new candle grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am cutting at a bud, inevitably. Jesus, go ahead and zoom into this just sort of area here, because I've got one scenario here and another scenario here, okay? So here you can see my cut. Are we in, Josh? Here you can see my cut and there's a bud, and I've left just maybe 2 or 3 millimeters of tissue so that I don't compromise the structure of that bud. Cut that big tip off and I've got a bud here. However, I'm just going to move this just slightly. Right here, I cut off the whole sort of new growth tip back to older needles, but inside of this, I'm pointing right here at a really small gray bud that exists in between those needles on that really nice fresh tissue. Sometimes I've got to cut back, leaving some of these older needles, because when I look at the other buds, these are quite small. Just 3 or 4 pairs of needles per shoot on this, whereas this is a full-blown candle right here. It's got 20 pairs of needles on it. If I need to feed these, I can't cut back to 3 or 4 pairs of needles and have the transpiration or loss of water happening in the needle mass to keep this branch alive. So I kept some of the older needles. I cut back to a bud that existed, which in a ponderosa pine, we will always have buds in vigorously growing tips. And these older needles are going to continue to draw to drive that strength into those smaller, lesser developed buds in the tree. So that's a great question.
And then Bill wants to know if you could describe the characteristics that are that define a semi-cascade form as opposed to the cascade form.
See now, I like that thought process, Bill. I like that thought process a lot, because automatically we're saying, okay, that acute angle of drop defines a cascade. What then becomes a good semi-cascade? When do we push towards the semi-cascade? Now, the semi-cascade is when we start to move a lot of foliage off of the base of the tree. Oftentimes semi-cascade are extending in a harmonious way outside of that container. We've got much less of a significant angle of drop. And most cascades, I would say, would be better when we talk about sort of, I've got this sort of bow in my trunk, I'm gonna make it a cascade. A semi-cascade with that more obtuse angle and that distance of movement is actually the better choice for a lot of the ways that the cascading form has been abused in bonsai design. However, we need to understand that that semi-cascade, in order to anchor that distance without dropping down, because when we take this and we drop, it shortens that distance, it shortens that draw of weight. When we lift that up and we elongate that weight from the base, we have to have the features of the base on the opposing side of that distance. So if we're moving to the right, I've got to have a strong base on the left to anchor that distance on the right. That base with that more obtuse angle of movement is what makes a great semi-cascade. And oftentimes in the semi-cascading form, we looked at dynamic on the design stream with a juniper, more sort of real elegant, feminine, quasi-literati, not quite literati, it's got too much foliage. And that branch is here, and we took that apex back here because the base was weak. We see dynamic as an execution of design be most commonly executed on the semi-cascade, where we're moving out here, and a lot of times we'll pull that apex back to pull that weight of that apical region of foliage mass so that that tree doesn't feel like in the harmonious form it's falling over, okay? And that's a really interesting aspect of semi-cascade design in particular.
That's all the questions we have for now.
Nice. Okay, well, let's see what we can get done here in terms of structure.
We're an hour in, just for your reference.
Money. Easy money.
And we've got the before photo ready.
Well, that's a lot of pressure to get this done then, isn't it?
It sounds like it.
I mean, no.
Thanks a lot.
Wait, no, just kidding.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, really let me down on that one. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm setting the structure. Again, I'm going to go through the rest of this tree and set the structure so I know and I can start to make some of those length decisions. This structure, what happens here, again, every action has a reaction. This structure that's happening here impacts what happens here, and what happens here is going to have to conversely come back and inform the pad formation, length, etc. on that sort of next level of design consideration. We've worked on our structural branches to this point. We've eliminated some structural branches and left gins in their place to show that negative space and that remnant in that gin of what used to be there. Now we're coming back in and we're wiring that structure to accommodate the spaces that we've made, start to redefine sort of that defining branch and whatnot. And I need to be continuing to educate myself. So as I move up into here, I'm going to be making more secondary, tertiary decisions. It's this staged sort of approach to design. And as I set this shape, I'm going to have a lot more knowledge around what's going to happen in those secondary, tertiary branches if I know where this shape is going, where that foliar mass is going to be, where that length is going to be. It helps me start to be able to read and dictate the design. So I haven't done any real heavy defining of this branch, but just in the setting of the structure, let me come back to the front there. Just in the setting of the structure, we see that massive movement back to the left. I like this. I do see that if this branch moves too far to the left, it's going to be too much weight coming this way. Automatically, I'm saying, cool, let's carry this out towards the front, somewhat serving what this lowest piece did, but this was too heavy, is too long. This starts to come back to the foreground and not pull too much weight back this way. Immediately, that change sort of has a ripple effect through the rest of the design. Let's see if we can get something kind of saucy on this guy. This has some fairly significant weight and torque on it. So, if I'm coming up, I need to start from the bottom. Let's go here. I love working on ponderosa pine just because they have a wildness about them and that lack of formality that longer needle has. It's almost kind of giving sort of, not in like a rude, like disgruntled teenager way, but it is giving a little bit of like a middle finger to bonsai convention. Kind of like, I've got these long needles, you think I can't be good? Screw you kind of a thing, but it's a little bit more respectful than that. It's kind of like, I really disagree with your convention.
David wanted to know, can you explain this first wire move that you're doing?
The first wire move that I'm doing?
He said, could you explain the first wire move you're doing?
Here or here? So
he might mean the first thing you're doing in general every time you apply wire?
Yeah, sure. So anytime I'm applying structural wire, I'm always starting at the junction where this first wire lowest down on the trunk starts, and I'm securing that shoulder. Now, I want to raise this branch. I want to elevate this branch. What that means in terms of my wire placement, and let me turn to Jesus so that we can see this more clearly. Show right in here. Okay. So I'm always starting my wire. If I'm going to combine this branch and this branch at the apex, I'm always starting my wire where this branch joins the trunk here, right? And this is a continuation of my trunk line, right? And so when I start this process, I've got to think, do I want to raise this or lower it? Now, if I want to raise it, I need to start on the underside of this, because when I raise this up, it wants to drop back down, and now this wire is stopping it from dropping back down. If I started on the top here to combine this branch to that branch, and I tried to raise it, it would literally pull the wire up off of that trunk and not give my movement function. It would decrease the functionality of the wire. So every time I'm setting a structural branch, I think, what direction do I want to move this? And that's what sets the tone for whether I approach from the bottom side or whether I come across the top here. Okay? Now I'm locking in both wires. Notice I have a turn and a half here, I have a turn and a half here. That secures this wire and it secures this wire. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to finish this wire, set this branch, and then come back and finish the second wire and set that branch. One of the biggest mistakes that I see made, or one of what I would consider to be the least proficient approaches to bonsai, is when you see people wire a whole tree out and then start designing, because your wire is directly responsive to what are you trying to accomplish with that branch in that region. So if I start wiring everything and I'm just wiring it and I'm not thinking about the function of my wire, and then I come back and start moving it, you see a lot of branches get cut off and wire no longer has like a partner to be wired in tandem with, and the wire doesn't function because you decide you want to raise there instead of lower. You've got to wire that branch and then start to position that branch so that every time we wire a piece, we put it in position and then we move on. This is proficient bonsai at a higher level. Getting through all these tiny buds in here. What a glorious problem to have. Makes for a little bit more technical wiring. It's interesting. We had our first weekend of pines, which we always start with pines in January. Is January the best time to repot pines? No, unless you have a greenhouse that you can control the temperature at. But because we have so many students and we also have so many trees, we always have to start as early as possible in the repotting process to get through all of our work. So we had Pines class this past weekend. And what was I going to say? One of the interesting things that's happening now at Mirai, since we've been here, this is actually going to be our 10th year, which is just crazy to me because I still feel like I came out of Japan like yesterday. And I still feel like I'm like 20 some years old in terms of maturity, which that's my own problem, not your guys' problem. But when looking at what I used to teach my students, number one, the knowledge has evolved. We've clearly continued to build on the knowledge. I left Japan with a high degree of technical knowledge, a minimal degree of design knowledge, not saying Mr. Kimura did not educate me, but there's so much about bonsai that you're not ready to know until you're ready to know. You know that saying, you don't know till you know? It's like, it's real, okay? And so the other thing about starting Mirai and starting work on all these collected trees was you don't have necessarily trees to be educating people on how you handle a mature tree, how you handle a root-bound tree that's been in bonsai cultivation for 6, 8, 10 years. And where we're at now is that's the bulk of the work that we currently have are trees that have been bonsai for a considerable portion of time. And the scope of that work, the repotting process, the design process, and revamping design is a totally different approach than the original approach of a raw tree because you've got more to work with. The technique for working the roots is different. The technique for revamping design is different. And the students got exposure this past weekend to field-grown trees, never before touched out of the field in terms of they've recovered from the field collection process. Collected trees, never repotted before, and trees that had been repotted and the root system was ready for another working. That was the first class in 10 years that I've been able to give students that breadth of knowledge, and all of the classes this year are going to get that. It was super monumental, and it's cool on Mirai Live because this spring's repotting streams, which we've planned out through April, are going to be very, very widespread in their scope to help you guys understand that knowledge and be able to address all of those specific nuances. And it reminds me, just talking about it, of the nuances to, say, a first styling where our focus is structure, to then that second working where we go into the secondary, tertiary. We take all that growth and we use it to advance the scaffolding of our tree, to then the tertiary, the finer tips and that real refinement level of work, how we handle that, how we manage that, how we prune that, how we wire that, how we design with that. The root system is a mirror reflection of the upper canopy of the tree. And if we keep that in mind, it only makes sense that we would be getting to a point now where we're doing that tertiary work on a lot of the trees that we originally did sort of that structure and that secondary work on in the very beginning years of Mirai and the defining concepts classes.
Someone, who was it? Eric wanted to know what gauge of wire you're using.
So right now, up here, the first piece of wire that we really kind of dove into the structural strategy and theory around was a 6. This is a piece of 8 gauge wire, right? And you say, why 8 gauge? Gosh, that seems awfully heavy. It does, but this is a very long branch that's holding all of its weight out at the tip with the foliar mass. If I don't use an 8 gauge, as rain and snow and wind and the next flush of growth occur, that 10 gauge wouldn't hold that shape for the next 2 to 3 years. So I always want to use a gauge of wire that, number one, allows me to move the branch anywhere, but number two, also compensates for what's to come, the elements and the weight of the additional foliar growth. I'm like breathing hard.
Doing some hard work over there.
I'm getting into it now.
Andrew said something kind of interesting that most styles of bonsai are representing nature in miniature, but Cascade is like a 1-to-1 to its form in nature. Maybe.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. I like that. I like that a lot. A little, almost like a purity to it.
Yeah.
I think, and it's when you see. So here's the thing. I want to ask you guys, how many cascading bonsai do you guys have in your collection? I want to know. How many cascading bonsai? And inside of that, if anybody just hates the form of cascade, I hate cascade, I want to know it. I want to know.
So we've got Tom has 1, Rafi has 2, Kip has 3, a couple folks have none. Couple more folks have 2. 2 seems to be our most popular answer right now.
Okay, and then how
and
many?
Kurt has 6.
All right, how many trees do they have in their collection?
Total. So we've got Joshua has 2 out of 18. Bill of Bill's Bayou has 1 full cascade. Tom has 60 trees in his collection. So does Kim. Patrick has 200.
Okay. So we're talking 60, 20, 40, 200, and they've got 2 cascades. This is interesting, right?
That is interesting.
Here's what I know. Here's what I know, having made a living doing bonsai for the past 10 years. If I make a tree a cascade, it isn't selling. Not going to sell. I know a cascading tree is not going to sell. Here's the other thing. Is there a more pure representation of nature in miniature? I love that point that was made, because there's not. This is the wildest form a tree can take on. I've never been able to figure that out, but here's what I'll also come clean with you guys about. There wasn't a single cascading tree at Mirai for the first 4 years of this garden. Right? This tree was actually the first cascade that we started at Mirai, where I was like, look at that. Cascades can be cool. And from then, it just exploded. Now we've got, I don't know, Troy, how many cascades do we have? Think so, altogether?
Troy says we have about a dozen.
I'm going to say we've got 30.
30.
Yeah, you got to think about that, because you got to think about the spruces on the rock, think about the Engelmann, think about all the ponderosas, think about the limbers, think about the Rocky Mountain junipers that are maybe inside of a pot but cascading off of their forms, think about the Jan Kulik, think about, right? Go through it all. Think about a few of the redwoods that we've formed as cascades. About 30 cascades in the garden. Same thing happened with forests. You guys saw the forest stream. You got to watch that process of my evolution. Didn't have a single forest at Mirai until we created that redwood forest. Built it in 2012. Didn't have another forest until 2015. Let that one soak in. Now we're forest crazy.
Haven't we always been, though?
I mean, no.
I guess so,
like
yeah.
this was the liberation of sort of the concepts of the cascade starting to take on value as I learned how to use them with more proficiency. This was the forest taking on a greater form of representation and dialogue as my bonsai approach matured. Now I'm going to go into another really interesting tidbit. How many literati bonsai do we have on site, Troy? I am. I'm putting you on the spot, because we exist with these trees every day. But it's interesting when you start looking at this. Very few literati. Maybe 5. Maybe 5. Right? 5 would be potentially generous. Right? That's become sort of that next wave of aesthetic exploration, is the literati form, but not many trees. We abuse the word literati or bunjin much the same as we abuse the idea of cascade, windswept, and the forest, right? We used crappy material to make forest. We used cascade as a secondary design decision for a tree we had no clue what else to do with. And as we start to utilize them in a greater capacity, we start to realize, oh, this is actually really, really good, okay? Starting to really tap into it now. We're starting to get some of those pieces up, setting the structure. I like what's happening here, right? I'm going to carry on to the backside, set the structure on that. We'll start to be able to dig into coming back to this and setting that refined form, right? I'm going to shift over to the other side of the tree so you guys aren't looking at the backside.
Thomas had a question about a rock composition with a cascade.
Yeah, what do you got, Tom?
He asked how would you sandwich 2 rocks together and attach a cascade to it?
How would you?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess a lot of that depends on what's the structure of the rock and what's the structure of the cascade, right? Because every single time that we start to create innovative compositions, we're problem solving in the same way that jazz musicians are problem solving in the creation of improvisation, right? And that's really where we start to see the value of having a greater amount of techniques and aesthetic understanding really sort of in our quiver of arrows that we can utilize in the creation of bonsai. And it's tough to know how we would do that. This is actually something, just not to let the cat out of the bag, but Jonathan Cross and I are working on with some bristlecone compositions, because when you go see the bristlecones, they're growing in this fractured limestone, and it's this really odd rock, and they're clearly penetrating the cracks. And Jonathan Cross goes and sees those after coming to Mirai, and he says, I want to make that. I want a bristlecone to be growing out of the crack of one of my ceramics. That means we've got to actually sandwich the fired product around the roots. How can we do that? He and I are trying to solve that problem right now, and it's not an easy one to solve, but it's possible, right? It's possible. It would be very customized to a tree. It would come with an adept knowledge of the root system and how the root system is actually behaving. Totally realistic and possible. You're on the outer cusp of bonsai techniques at that point in time. That's a place we like to dwell at Mirai. And I think as these techniques, we start to see them more and more, we become more comfortable with techniques. With the expansion of technique comes the process of creative inspiration, because all of a sudden, I can do this. What can I do with this? What can I do? How do I take the techniques I know to achieve this? That kind of engineering, this is exactly what led to Mr. Kimura changing bonsai forever. He was an engineer first, a horticulturalist second, right? He was always thinking about, how do I creatively solve this problem to put these trees on two stones that V down in the bottom of a valley, right? One of his most famous compositions is the Hinoki cypress on the two Kurama slabs that he fit together. Diamond bits, significant engineering, epoxy, a little touch up on those stones. I mean, it was a major composition to create, a major composition to transport, a major composition to pull into the workshop and handle. One of the most powerful bonsai that exists in the world right now, right? You're tapping into sort of that next level right there with that idea. I don't know if it's sold. Did it sell? Oh, really? Well, so Mr. Kimura's forests have been sort of in the headlines for, as long as his name has been associated with really innovative, cutting-edge bonsai. So it's tough to know, but for a long time he would not sell his most avant-garde pieces. And then all of a sudden the demand for them was so high that he started producing pieces just for the purpose of selling, which is definitely a new approach for him with those stone plantings. So I don't know, maybe he's at a point where he is starting to sell more of his compositions. But I would be surprised if he sold that, and also at the same time, maybe not so surprised. Come back over here. These back branches, these are always the monsters. How we doing on time, Sam?
We are an hour and 20 minutes in.
Okay, so we'll finish this tonight.
You said it was a 50-50 shot.
50-50 shot. Old man had a little bit of extra gas in the tank once we started going. I say old man, I busted my back up today again. You'd think I would work smarter, not harder, but I worked stupidly today. And I told Troy I did it, and Troy said, "Oh, you shouldn't have tried to pick that tree up on your own. That was a bad idea."
I think that's what I said too.
That's the natural. Anytime somebody hurts their back, it's like, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." It's like, well,
thank you for your advice.
Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for that insight. I appreciate that immensely.
That's why we've got the dingo.
That's what my dad said tonight.
Oh.
He's like, "How you doing?" I was like, "I hurt my back today." He's like, "Isn't that why you got the dingo?" I was like, "Yes." That's what no comment. Sometimes we're just not as intelligent as we should be. Okay, so I've got this kind of last lingering piece here, and this is like the highest point of the apical region. It's grown straight up in the air, and it's kind of this big, thick, chunky, really crappy branch. I actually, you know what? I'm not even gonna entertain its function in the design. I'm gonna go ahead and just take this off because it's never gonna be translatable into a good branch. Okay, but I still need to get this point. Let me roll this around where Jesus is at. Give me just a second here, Jesus. Showing this location right here. Okay, so I had this piece sticking up. It was thick, coarse. You can see the size of the wound that it left. I'll clean that up. But this coming up higher than where my apex is actually originating from, if this is not the apex, I need to lower this and really sandwich this down. So I'm going to come back with a thicker wire and just make sure that I get the kind of rotation and position on this wire that gives me the function to be able to handle this.
Got a couple questions. This one's, I think, a little more philosophical, but Nathan wants to know, is there a negative perception to blurring the line between penging and bonsai, specifically in incorporating more of the natural landscape to give a setting for the tree in its natural environment?
Nathan, I've been asking myself that same question. I think that penging is highly misunderstood. And I think beyond being misunderstood, I think it's a little bit discriminated against because it definitely differs from the aesthetic that we have come to understand a little bit better and that we've come to value in the bonsai form. And it's an interesting thing that happens when people start to feel like they understand, because it makes for this staunch refusal to take on any new ideas in the fear that, I think this is my theory, and it's a fear that they're going to go back to the level of not understanding again. But I think one of the things that a lot of people are starting to look at with penging is here is this art form that was not practiced readily in China for a significant amount of time, that is largely misunderstood in the Western world because of its different sort of structure of penging master. We're used to bonsai master. And in that lack of understanding and sort of almost like a lost art kind of a thing, with the resurgence of penging and the revival of Chinese penging / bonsai, they're buying a lot of bonsai from Japan. One of the interesting things to observe is when a bonsai bought in Japan that's exported to China gets to China, it inevitably over 2 years changes form, right? It moves more towards the penging aesthetic based on the hands that are touching it. Now, are they trying to maintain it as a bonsai? Yes. Can they maintain it in the Japanese aesthetic? No. Why? They're not Japanese. Not Japanese. Every exported bonsai that's gone to China is moving towards the penging because this is culturally a reflection of Chinese culture in this representation of nature in miniature. It's the most fascinating occurrence that I've seen happening outside of, each culture trying to find their own approach in the exploration that's occurring. And I think it's brilliant. But I think there's a lot to be learned from penging in terms of our own approaches to trying to sort of explore aesthetics unique to the environments that we understand and the culture that's sort of impacting us. Ah, yes, I see this tree again for the first time. That looks awesome. Okay, we're gonna rotate a little bit more, still a little bit long on the right side. I may not keep that longest branch, but we see that proportion. Let me go a little bit more for you guys. That's more appropriate to where you're at. Okay, and we start to see the apex coming back. It's a little bit long on the right side. We're gonna need to tweak that. That branch might be a little bit long. Notice how valuable this branch is. This branch in the back of the tree giving depth to this space so your eye doesn't escape the design. That's an important, pivotal piece of the design. All right, let's dive into a little bit of stylistic decision-making and sort of execution here. See where this takes us. Definitely on another journey, for sure.
Ready for some questions?
I'm ready.
Well, Kip would like to know, from a personal perspective, is there a type of tree or species that you would say you don't ever want to work with?
No.
Cool.
No, it doesn't exist, because here's the thing, like what I've found, just sort of looking at myself and my practice inside of bonsai, if there's something that I'm looking at that I'm like, that sucks, I don't want to do that, I don't like that. Oftentimes what it's telling me is that I'm either afraid of it, I'm resistant to it because I don't understand it, or I'm not sure that I can have success with it. This has been my experience to date. And what I've tried to, and this is, I'm not, obviously nobody's perfect in trying to confront those areas of weakness, right? Olives. I've told you guys before, I'll tell you again, my Achilles heel in bonsai is olives. I have never ever successfully cultivated an olive. When I have to water Troy's olives in the garden over the summertime, I literally look at them and I'm just like, please don't die. Please don't die on me, right? Like, Troy has given you way too much love and attention for me to take you out now. And I've got to confront that. Like, I love olives. I think olives are amazing. Most people in the world literally throw olives on the ground and they start to grow. For whatever reason, I've never been able to have success with olives. They just, it's like the kryptonite to my bonsai passion. But now my curiosity is, all right, let's figure out everything there is to know about olives. So much so that I went down to Puglia last year with Ricardo to look at the ancient Roman olives. I want to know olives because I don't want to have this feeling about olives that is negative. It's not their shortcoming, it's sort of mine in the bonsai practice and approach. And so, sort of addressing each one of those limitations, my hope is that I get to a point where I just, everything's on the table. And that's really where I've tried to orient people saying, can you do sagebrush? Right now, sagebrush is a big curiosity of mine. And I think I have a solution to sagebrush that will cut down on their short-term life expectancy or difficulty as a bonsai, make them more workable. I'll let you know about that. I won't keep that a secret, but I definitely need to try it before I start promoting sort of my theories around sagebrush. But sagebrush, everybody's like, sagebrush? Why would you want sagebrush? They grow everywhere. Well, cool. So do Doug fir and ponderosa pine. It's the most widely distributed pine in North America. So do azaleas, and yet everybody loves those. Why wouldn't we love sagebrush?
So Eric wants to know, what is your experience with your back and the dingo teach you about patience, and how does bonsai teach you patience?
So this is one of the funny things. This is one of the hilarious things about bonsai. If somebody that's never seen bonsai comes to Mirai, they're like, wow, you must have so much patience. And it's like, no, I don't have any patience, quite the opposite. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing, these ridiculous projects that nobody with a team this small would ever take on, logically thinking about just sort of the practicality of it. But beyond that, Mr. Kimura was not a patient person. And in fact, I'm going to say Mr. Kimura was the most impatient person I've ever met in my entire life. And it was that impatience that drove his technique to really expand, to be able to execute that technically at a faster pace and horticulturally solve some of the riddles that were slowing the process down. It's created some of the most brilliant bonsai in the world. You cannot duplicate the impact and the benefit of time, but the lesson of patience is sort of like my theory at Mirai is just have more so you have less time to spend and you're not sitting there waiting for them to behave, right? This could be a faulty strategy based on the fact that I'm doing this work on this ponderosa at a time where it's going to give me longer needles as a result of not having gotten to it. With the dingo and that sort of a thing, I feel like that's still more like feeling like I'm 20-something years old than 37, which is what I am now. And those are the lessons I think that we learn as our body changes, and we're like, oh, I can't just pick up a tree any old-fashioned way. I've got to use my legs. I've got to straighten my back. I didn't do that today. I failed miserably.
Chad wants to ask about the pot that this is in because he feels that it is a little tame for Mirai.
That's interesting that you say that. I will make another confession, and actually you guys can hear this conversation with Ron Lang, and you can hear the evolution of the conversation with Ron Lang Part 2 on the podcast. If you haven't listened to our podcast with Ron Lang, both the first one and then the second one, I would encourage you to do so, because one of the things that's continued to roll around in my head is that when we think about breaking outside of sort of the standard approach to bonsai that has created the aesthetic that might not necessarily work with or be as dramatic as the trees that we have at our disposal in the natural environment in the Western world, we might not be doing them justice. One of the things that I've continued to feel might be stunting our move towards a truer exploration or execution of aesthetic is the ceramic body. It is the ceramic body, because ultimately the ceramic body is what makes it bonsai, tree and tray, okay? And so when we start to reconceptualize the ceramic body, whether it's metal, whether it's wood, whether it's nothing, Michael Hagedorn's work where he completely eliminates the ceramic from it, it takes on a different thing. It becomes something different. And is it different enough to not call it bonsai? I don't care about that right now. That's not really where the goal is like to just do something so radically different that it's not even the same thing anymore. But the wildness of the container is definitely a tool that I think Horst Heinzelreiter's work has shown us, that I think if you look at like Thor Holvilla from Sweden and some of the really real Scandinavian rustic, almost Viking-esque forms that he's creating, very interesting. Skoda from, I'm not sure where Skoda's from, somewhere in the Eastern European countries. His work has a real grit to it that's very beautiful and appeals to people. And all of a sudden you start to recognize, okay, so this really refined form isn't necessarily the end-all be-all, but it is an aesthetic. And one of the other aspects of Western aesthetic that I really like is modernism, and the idea of clean lines and simplicity contrasting with the organic form. When you have really clean lines and a really organic form, sometimes the organic form stands out more than when you try to create organic with rustic. Right? And so that mixture and that exploration of organic and modern and clean lines and simple forms and organic with rustic and grit and real sort of wild, I think there's room for all of it. Is this as gritty as this tree could handle? No. Do I think this pot is a good selection, size, shape, proportion, and aesthetic for this tree? I think to some degree it makes this tree look more rugged being in this container. I think to some degree it makes it look a little tame. And that's where I also feel like when people respond so dramatically, so vehemently opposed to certain containers and certain aesthetics, I always step back and kind of look at that like, that's interesting that you're so passionate about that being not what you would do, instead of just looking at it and saying, okay, that's interesting. That's an approach. That's one way you could go about it. And guess what? We can always repot the tree into another pot, right? We can always play with that aesthetic. This is the beauty of bonsai. It's changing. What will this tree go into next? Probably go into a grittier pot. We've seen its combination with Ron being the head of ceramics at MICA, Maryland Institute of Ceramic Art, and sort of the impact of modern aesthetics on some of the things that he preferentially brings to his ceramics is super interesting. Nobody was really doing that. Even though this has a real traditional kind of design to it, there's still a Ron Langness to this that I think is quite beautiful. There's a lack of bells and whistles. There's the use of an inset band as opposed to a pronounced edge on the foot. There are things that make this subtly different than the really traditional form of this, but there's room. There's room for it all. And there's room for it all with the exact same tree. And it's okay.
So Andrew has a question that's kind of an overall bonsai question too. So he says it's been stressing him out. As bonsai outgrow their old styles, we cut them back to smaller branches or buds, but eventually bark covers up where buds can form and trees continue to grow. Is there a point to where a bonsai can no longer be compacted or cut back?
Absolutely.
And it truly becomes too large, not enough branching. Is there an end to a bonsai's life, even if it does not die?
That's a stellar point that you just made, and I'm going to relieve all of your stress about this in one fell swoop. There's a reason why in the first 3 years that a tree comes out of the mountains that you fertilize it aggressively, you sacrifice needle length, and you focus entirely on building as much needle mass, however hideous it is, right? And this is particularly pertinent to the ponderosa pine, although not entirely isolated too, okay? We sacrifice that, we build up that needle mass, and what that needle mass gives us is vascular tissue. Now, when a tree is in the natural environment, and sort of follow me through this process because this is not a one-sentence answer. When a tree is in the natural environment and it's naturally stunted, what that means is it doesn't have the resources to grow at its maximum capacity, or else this would be a 120-foot tall ponderosa pine, okay? And as a result of it not being able to grow at its maximum capacity, that lack of ability to grow at max capacity not only impacts the height of the tree, but also every aspect of growth. Okay? And some of the growth that it impacts is the growth of the bark or the cork cambium. Now, a branch only becomes incapable of backbudding once the cork cambium has covered the adventitious potential of vascular expansion. What does that mean? Well, along the length, and Jesus, go ahead and focus on this branch here. Okay? Along the length of this branch, you can see a definitive transition point, and it's unfortunate I didn't show you guys before the wire. Notice how it's still smooth and gray here, and you start to see these little furls of bark lifting off. And then when we go up here, notice how this is significantly more furled and this is actually creating bark. There's a line right here, right below this wire where the bark stops and it's starting to evolve here. This is the creep of the cork cambium over the tissue that has the potential to backbud. Now, once we bring this tree into domesticated culture and we start to facilitate needle elongation and vascular expansion, we also facilitate the expansion of the cork cambium at a more rapid pace. We can't stop this from happening because the tree is getting resources and it's growing faster. And we would know this if we cut this tree in half and see the growth rings and how thick the growth rings are, or how much growth it's putting on now that it's become a bonsai. So in the first 3 years, while this cork cambium is still in that stunted, sort of underdeveloped position, farther back on the branches, we feed aggressively, we get long needle length, we get vascular expansion, and we get backbudding. And that's what's formed the interior growth on this tree. When we cut back those tips to those interior pieces of growth, we transition from the tip of the tree to the interior pieces of the tree. And here's what's going to happen. These are going to elongate, but the base of those is that really rich vascular tissue where backbudding forms. And so we're going to get backbudding on these short little pieces, and these short little pieces, and these short little pieces. And this is going to get denser and denser and denser. Now, had I not taken advantage of that first 3 years when the cork cambium was still very far back and I had a tremendous amount of potential tissue for backbudding, that cork cambium would have covered that up as I'm trying to hold back the needle length and keep it small and not develop the tree, overly pluck the needles, overly manage the growth, and I would not have all of these backbuds tight and compact into the tree that will maintain the tree for forever. Because now that I have these, they're going to backbud on themselves. And I'm never going to get any buds farther in from this, but I'm always going to have buds right around this region. And that's why this styling at this point is so important, to really push the energy into those and start to facilitate that transition from those tips to the interior once the tree has reached that excessive form and shape. Now I will always have, because of those first 3 years when I fed and I got these interior shoots, I will always have interior growth. It'll bud on itself. And when one of these little buds buds, I get buds on that bud. And when that buds and buds, I get buds on that bud. And it'll always stay compressed after this point in time, but you have to get it first. You have to focus on getting it first. If you take those steps, you'll always have something to cut back to.
So back to the penging conversation for a minute. Eric wanted to know if miniatures like tire swings and farmhouses could become part of American bonsai. He wants to do a farm scene with a house and a maple or oak and a field. Does that count as penging?
I mean, I think that, I mean, does it count as pinging? It's not really pinging because it's sort of based on different principles and concepts. Is it something else? Yeah, it's probably something else. Is it cool or not? It depends on with what level you execute that scenery and what sensation it evokes as to whether it's cool or not. But it's not for me to judge whether that's cool. I mean, I think some people would consider it kitschy, but maybe nobody's ever done it really, really well. And that's where, if you're gonna do something, Mr. Kimura used to tell me this all the time. If you're gonna do something, if you're gonna change the way that things are done, you better do so really freaking well. Because if you do so half-assed and it's just half as good as the way it's always been done, then people are gonna lack the ability or not see the merit in it, and it's gonna be detrimental more than positive. So if you choose to do this, if you choose to deviate from the aesthetics, you choose to go out on your own path, do so, but do so well. Do it well. Do it to the best it can possibly be done. And once you do it to that level, it becomes undeniable. It becomes absolutely undeniable. So I would encourage you to, but I would say if you're gonna do that, better do it well.
Nathan wanted to know, and he didn't really put much else in this question, but what about psyche as opposed to pinging?
Yeah, so pinging is the Chinese form, right? And pinging has a lot of connotation, particularly when there's the use of the figurines and some of the containers that have bodies of water in them and sort of the display of stone and stuff. Pinging, and I'm not I'm not a really well-versed historian on pinging, but it's all over the internet if you really wanted to educate yourself on what catalyzed pinging. Pinging, to the best of my knowledge, was based a lot around a lot of Buddhist concepts and a lot of Taoist concepts that guided some of the aesthetics and some of the compositions reflecting actual events related to beliefs and sort of religious practices. When you talk about psyche is almost like the Japanese form of what we call pinging, right? It's the use of sort of this landscape and the creation of the stone and all of this stuff, but it's not rooted in the same sort of religious backbone as pinging is. And so, how do you draw the distinction between the two? One is Chinese, one is Japanese. Which one's better than the other, that would depend on, sort of the eye of the viewer and the taste. What's going on, Lem? What are you doing? Oh, it's up in the house. It'll take a different device. Sorry.
YouTube on my phone.
So,
it's not YouTube Kids, though. Be careful.
YouTube Kids.
Well, I don't want to show your child anything I'm not supposed to.
Right. Right. Counterculture. Flurry of activity. I was like, what's happening? Why is so much stuff happening all of a sudden? Behind the camera, what you guys never see is all of the stuff. Eve and Josh were talking, and then Eve and Jesus were talking, and then all of a sudden Lime is up there, and I see Taft in the window, and it's just like, and I'm talking to you guys, trying not to acknowledge that there's chaos all around me, while I'm also making a bonsai tree. It's nuts. This happens every single Tuesday.
So how does bonsai teach you patience, Ryan?
Yeah, right. As I start to nervously twitch. I never actually know the funny thing about it is, like, my job is to do bonsai. I never actually know what is going on when everybody's like talking, and when we used to have so many problems with the stream, when, before we kind of got things dialed in, it was always like, oh, great, there's something catastrophic happening right now. It really used to faze me. I had a hard time focusing. I'm curious, Sam, how you think this is coming along. Let me go ahead and bring it back.
This is one of those ones where some nights I expect a tree, like, to an unpracticed eye, Some trees are going to transform a lot more than others. And this one, because it has such a distinct style, I was not thinking it would be like a massive transformation, but it totally is. And like,
Oh, that's exciting.
yeah, it is exciting. And just like how much space has been created in it is shocking and appealing. It's pleasing to me.
I think, I asked you that for a very specific reason, because a lot of times when you have a styled tree, I think that people tend to buy into the fact that, oh, okay, it's styled and, like you're going to wire it a little bit and it's going to look a little bit different. But it's like, no, actually, when we come to this point where we go all the way around this sort of one singular revolution of this tree's initial aesthetic existence, this second working is a big point, because coming back to the idea that how are you going to get to a point where this thing is just forever too big because it can't backbed any further? And it's like, no, this reworking from the first aesthetic to the second sort of iteration is actually one of the most, and what I've found, it's taken a lot of, what I used to have was just this tremendous amount of reverence and excitement for the initial styling. And I still have that, don't get me wrong, don't misinterpret what I'm saying. But what I've developed is a tremendous amount of passion for this second working, because I've recognized how powerful this is towards creating that actual first real true iteration once everything that you conceptualized has grown out or would grow out. Like when you first design a tree, you're like, this is gonna be longer and this is gonna be here and this is gonna be awesome. Well, now we're here. Now it's awesome, right? So then we get to come back in and we get to see all of that through. And there are a lot of professionals in the world, and I felt this when I first started. Like, their interest is in the first styling. They're really not into continued development and evolution. They don't really, they kind of travel around and do a lot of first stylings all over the world, and that's like the way that they make their living as a bonsai professional. But how much this understanding and evolving these trees to the second iteration, it's impossible to quantify how much this has changed the way that I style trees the first time. Because you start to see the structural things that happen if you sacrifice quality or structural integrity. You start to see the change of aesthetic with the time based on the decisions that you made. And that becomes pretty monumental towards the aesthetic of the tree and your ability as a professional to handle any piece of material well. It's almost to the point where I would say, I don't think you can be a bonsai professional without developing your trees. I don't think it's possible. I don't think that's a bonsai professional. I think that's a bonsai performer.
Kim wants to know, why is the apex so flat?
Still not done, so
okay.
just bear with me here. Bear with me now.
And then Gary wants to know, has or will the deadwood be treated?
It hasn't, and I would say there will probably come a point. Now, this is where we get into different ages of trees. This is an extremely, extremely old ponderosa pine. You say, well, how do you know it's an old ponderosa pine? It looks very old. Every ponderosa pine looks very old because they've got this rugged bark. Actually, the tree in the garden that you would, if you came here and I said, pick out the oldest ponderosa pine, I promised you the tree that everybody would pick and say is the oldest ponderosa pine is actually probably the youngest ponderosa pine. And you start to say, okay, well, so how do you know that a ponderosa pine is old? One of the ways that you know that a ponderosa pine, as well as a Rocky Mountain juniper, is old is by looking at the prolonged longevity of the deadwood without treatment, right? How much wear and tear does that deadwood show, and how hard and preserved and durable is that deadwood? Because when we start to talk about age, and this same thing was something that occurred to me with California junipers long ago. How do you know the age of a California juniper? Well, a California juniper that's young has termite damage. A California juniper that's old has solid deadwood. Because the younger trees, without the injection of resin into the core of that deadwood, become very susceptible to termites, and with that presence of resin, termites can't digest that tissue, and all of a sudden, you don't have termite damage on the oldest trees. With ponderosa pine, when you start to see really hard, solid deadwood that continues to be hard and solid, you know that that has a tremendous amount of resin in them, because ultimately ponderosa pine wood and pines in general are fairly soft. But if you go back, say, even to the southern United States, and you look at the old growth yellow pine that they used to use in bowling alleys, right? And to say, wait, hang on just a sec, they used pine in bowling alleys? They used pine in bowling alleys. It was not the part where the ball landed on, but it was the lane that the ball rolled down. This is very, very highly prized wood right now, right? Yellow, heartwood yellow pine. Those pines, because of their resin injection, were extremely hard and extremely durable. And this dead wood is not, over the course of the past, I said what I say, that we styled this 7 years ago, this dead wood has not changed. It has not reduced, it has not sloughed off, it has not become soft. It has held true for the past 7 years under the Pacific Northwest conditions of intense moisture. And so I have a lot of confidence that this is going to continue to perpetuate itself, but once it does, and it will at some point turn the corner and start to get a little bit pithier and a little bit softer, that's where we go into the wood hardening practice of preserving the dead wood.
Nick wants to know, is Cascade rare because it seems so difficult to form if it's not Yamadori?
I actually think that Cascade is rare because nobody's really pointed out what makes a good cascade, and most of our interpretations of a cascade are really poor examples of the style. This would be my first point. Second point is there's a little bit of a misconception that cascade are hard to maintain, right? And one of the things that somebody that I very much respected used to tell me when I was just getting into bonsai is that you should maintain a cascade tilted up on an angle so that you push that branch out into sunlight, otherwise it will get weak. And this is how you have to cultivate cascade. What I've learned is that this branch over here, and what you guys have seen, it's just as strong as the apex of this tree was. There is no limitation to the strength that a cascading branch can have as long as it has availability to sunlight. And the way most cascades are formed is that long branch is always underneath the canopy instead of out getting the sunlight. And this is where the cascade design has created a lot of problems for people. So I think with an improved knowledge of cascades, how we style them to maintain their longevity and their sustainability in terms of design, and with the knowledge that we have, or hopefully have, around their continued design aesthetic, along with the elements that create a great cascade, my hope is that starting to highlight some of these bonsai styles that you don't see often discussed, that we'll start to explore them more, because there is no more dramatic form than the cascade. In terms of like pure drama, this thing is hanging off a cliff. You can't really argue. It's definitely hanging off a cliff. It's not hanging off of like a grassy knoll or anything like that, although the moss can be deceptive from that perspective. And that's a whole conversation for another time.
Nathan wants to know, is there a situation where you would opt to use 2 smaller gauge wires on a branch as opposed to 1 larger gauge wire, or is that just considered bad form?
Bad form. Only time that we would do that, and I say bad form, there is one scenario where I would say, yes, that is a good idea. Okay, and that one scenario where I would say, yes, that is a good idea is, say for example, you have one really thick branch, and then you've got another really thick branch that branches into 2 smaller branches. Okay, let's do this. Let's take those 2 smaller branches and the gauge of wire that united gives us the strength to move this thicker portion, and carry those 2 onto the subsequently tandem paired thicker branch. So we wire both of those thinner pieces with a single wire, they double up on that, and they double up on the branch they're being combined in tandem with. That would be the only time where I would say 2 wires is acceptable. The idea that people utilize, the idea of 2 smaller wires being just as good as 1, is not true. It absolutely is not true. The wire that allows you to move it anywhere, that's the technique, okay? It improves the aesthetic, it improves the function, and it is definitively the higher level of both technique, aesthetically, and functionally. But you do have to be able to use thicker wire, and that means understanding technique. And if only there were a place that was talking about how do you effectively structurally wire, how do you form your strategy, what are the techniques to applying structural wire, if only that existed.
So Mike wants to know, is there not some quote, reversal of the influence of auxins in a cascade, thinking that they are strongest at the highest parts of a tree?
You have to dive into, and man, you guys are knocking it out of the park tonight. These are outstanding questions. You have to dive into what actually leads to the accumulation of auxin to be able to answer that, right? And here's the thing about auxin, and this is relatively recent knowledge, like within the past 2 years kind of knowledge. We've always known, always. When I was in college in 2000 to 2004, we knew auxin was produced in the tip of the branch, okay? But what we didn't know at that point in time is that auxin is also produced in the tip of the root. Now, here's why this matters. If auxin is produced in the tip of the branch, then it's very easy to see how the branches in the apex of the tree could produce more auxin with more exposure to sunlight. But technically, that idea of auxin being more greatly accumulated in the apex of the tree, if this cascading branch has the same exposure to sunlight, i.e. we leave it facing south in our bonsai garden and it never experiences any less sunlight than the apex of the tree, that falls short, okay? So when we started to understand that in addition to the auxin produced in the tip of the branch, auxin is also produced in the tip of the root, and it hitches a ride on water molecules up to the place where that water molecule is evaporated, we know that the place that's transpiring, the place that's losing the most water in the tree, is the place that's going to accumulate the most auxin, because it's producing auxin naturally itself, and it's transpiring a lot of water based on its exposure to sun and wind that's causing the accumulation of the root tip created auxin to also increase in that area. And this is what leads to apical dominance more than the actual generation in the tip itself, okay? So when we start to look at that, and we start to say, okay, so if this branch has the same sun exposure, has the same transpiration, all of those things, then it definitely makes sense that it shouldn't have any less it shouldn't have any more weakness. It shouldn't be set back any further than the apex of the tree. It discounts everybody's assumption of auxin in the way a cascading branch should occur or perform in bonsai cultivation. And all of a sudden we start to recognize, oh, all of these sort of myths and legends about the cascading form and its weakness and its inability to be able to rival apical dominance, they're totally false. They're all totally false. And I can say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, at Mirai, that the cascading branches of every single one of our cascading trees are equally as strong, if not stronger, than the apex of the tree. And it's simply based on orientation towards the southern portion, being in the northern hemisphere, that we get that sun exposure and transpiration and accumulation of auxin in the tip that makes it equally as strong.
So Leonard's question connects to this, and then I have another question to ask after this. But Leonard thinks that's an interesting fact, because aren't so many of the collected trees from the rocks in the mountains real cascade? So how do you keep that aesthetic to maintain the Spartan aspect of the tree?
A lot of them are cascades, but more than cascades, a lot of them are just simply laterally growing, laying on the rock. This tree was actually laying on the rock. And here's an interesting thing to observe. You see all of this dead wood on the face that we've chosen. When you roll this tree around, notice how the majority of the bark is on this backside. This tree was clearly laying down, and the surface that was exposed to the elements, to the sun and ultraviolet deterioration, is oftentimes where the deadwood exists, the live vein usually on the stone side, protected. And this is particularly true of junipers. Almost inevitably on a juniper, the live vein will be against the rock, the tree will grow along the rock, and we start to stand these up and create upright trees out of these forms, right? And then that's how we present these characteristics. So whether we stand them upright or we cascade them down matters not to the physiology of the tree. The tree does not care. It's surviving. That's it. It's just being driven by the mechanism of water movement, which is driven by the loss or transpiration of water based on the elements and its exposure to the ability to photosynthesize, as well as to accumulate those hormonal pieces that guide its navigation system of growth, i.e. auxin.
And then Bill from Bill's Bayou wants to know, what is the story behind this design? Is this a tree which has fallen over? Is this a number one branch which has lost the top of a tree? Or has this tree simply been growing in this cascading way?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the story of this one is. I haven't honestly thought about the dialogue, that kind of accompanies the design. That's That's an interesting question. I would say I would leave that up to each one of you to kind of cultivate the story for it. I don't particularly have one beyond the fact that it's cascading, and oftentimes you think of a cascade needing to move away from the base, but when this is growing off of a cliff, there's nothing saying that it growing forward is totally unreasonable. And in fact, it's probably potentially a little bit more natural than moving so far away from it if it's truly clinging to life. But we were doing some styling of a juniper cascade that's planted on a rock that you'll see on our social media in the next couple days. And we started looking at the ancient Phoenician junipers of coastal France. And if you look at those, they almost all fall straight down and they stay in this columnar type growth cascading down along the rocks. It's fascinating. It's a totally unique take on cascading form based on those conditions. And I forget, Troy, do you remember that valley? If people wanted to look that up, where those Phoenicians were growing that we were looking at. They're like the oldest Phoenicians in the world. They're very, very interesting trees. Getting closer.
Getting real close.
Yeah, we're up to the apex now. And then I got to step back and take a look, and we'll make the tweaks that a lot of everybody's saying, why is the apex so flat and this needs to be shorter and stuff. I'm a little bit too myopically involved in the design right now, but I will get there with you guys.
Douglas wants to know, looking back at the extent of work done tonight, will you be greenhousing this
Yeah,
afterwards?
good question. Good question.
Or back to the ground outside?
I will probably put this outside because we've had such a mild winter, but it'll be sort of an earmark in my mind. If we drop much below 28 degrees, I'll probably pull it in. Is this tree susceptible to frost damage? No. Is it susceptible to intense, prolonged freeze? I would say with the work that we've done tonight, we've reduced enough foliage mass, and I'll show you guys the foliage mass we've reduced just so you can get a handle on it when we look at the before and after of this. It's had enough reduction that I would say it's not tolerant to the same kinds of cold that it would be had we not touched it.
And then kind of piggybacking on that, Chad says, when we work pines and junipers in the winter, often we're encouraged to protect the trees from cold and wind in a greenhouse. What exactly are we protecting against when we do that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, understanding the physiology of this is the most important aspect of educating yourselves and making decisions. So what we know is that a tree protects itself from cold by storing all of the sugars and starches it creates over the fall season. And it loads those sugars and starches into the vacuole of the cell. The vacuole inside of the cell is the water holding component of a cell that keeps the tree turgid and upright and not, doesn't allow it to wilt. When you start to put sugars and starches into that vacuole that's filled with water, you actually start to increase the solute content, decrease the content of water, and just like the ocean with dissolved salt, decrease the temperature at which that water freezes. Now, that's the antifreeze, the storage of sugars and starches over the fall. In the spring, when a tree starts growing, it starts taking in water through the roots and taking all of that stored sugar and starch and moving it cell to cell up to the tips where transpiration is taking place to fuel cellular division at the tip and give us new needles. That's where that stored energy creates foliar mass the following spring. But when we go in and we heavily prune a tree, in order to compartmentalize each of these prunes, foliar reduction, damage that's done during the moving process, it evacuates those cells of those dissolved sugars and starches to patch and compartmentalize that damage, and that's where we see the reduction of cold tolerance in a tree work during the dormant portion of the year.
More on cold tolerance. Rafi says he doesn't understand why working on the tree now affects its cold tolerance, as all the resources needed for cold tolerance were stored during the fall. So now what's removed doesn't affect that. But then he said you answered it.
So I just answered it. But what Rafi said for the longest time was where my knowledge came up short with my students. Because you say, okay, it accumulates all these sugars and starches with the foliage over the season, and now you've got them stored, but don't work on your trees. And the question is, why? These are super adept questions. You're exactly right to ask that question. It wasn't until I read a scientific article, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, and I don't even know where I found it. I stumbled upon it looking up stuff on auxin and cytokinins. And they talked about with the reduction of the auxin in the tip, the tree evacuates to compartmentalize and to restructure the presence of auxin in the tree, because when we remove auxin in the tree, it doesn't have a navigation system to grow next spring. So it's sitting here going, I lost my map. I don't know what to do. And it starts to try and to activate water movement and starts to activate auxin production. Even though temperatures are low and it's hard and it's struggling and it's not working very well, the tree automatically starts to spring into action, and that's where we see that loss of cold hardiness. All right, let me step back and see where we've gotten. I'm sure the apex looks horrific. I'm sure some things are too long on the right side. That's totally where we should be. Looks a little planular, doesn't it? We need to spice this up a little bit. Okay, let's spice it up. Let's do a little bit of work. Okay, first and foremost, I notice how long this is. I want to pull this here. I want this to engage the viewer, and I want to swing it around towards the front, okay? So let's go ahead and just make this big move, just to start to create a little bit of sauce. All right, and now I've got some buds on the inside here. This is clearly too long. I'm going to shorten this big bud back to the interior where I've got some smaller buds existing right at that tip. Further reduction. Okay, and maybe I need to just drop this. This piece here is really important now that we chose to eliminate that longer piece. Okay, let me see if I can make this a little bit spicier. So that gives us a little bit of elevation change. That goes there. Now this is going to come around back into here so that we don't have so much length over here. When I start to pull this length back, it makes this stand alone instead of having this big sort of sheet. So by using that and redirecting this length towards the back, I start to be able to isolate this as a really unique, singularly growing pattern. I like that a lot. Yeah, I want to show some of that movement. I like that. It feels a little bit better. Let me see if I give this a little bit more dimension here. There we go. Starts to fill it out a little bit more. Boom. Okay, so now we've got a little bit more of that cascading effect. Now let's kind of come over to here. This feels okay. Doesn't feel necessarily bad. Feels a little bit sort of focused in this one area. Let's give it a little bit of lateral breathability here. Just pushing that down so that we don't have, when this was in here, we almost had this straight diagonal line across that, made it feel very flat and very planular. When I drop that branch down into this space, now I go here, 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 and I change that singular diagonal line by forming that dip. That is one of the most important aspects of creating a good cascade. And let me show that to you again, okay? If I take this branch up into here, now notice this diagonal line. Makes the tree feel planular in terms of form. We see that? Okay, now watch what happens. Drop that down in there. And now all of a sudden we get boom, up into this space and then back down. And it gives that motion, that occupation of that negative space and that change of that static line in the silhouette to have that movement, right? Mr. Kimura used to make this change for the first 4 years of my apprenticeship. That change right there. And I didn't understand it, and I couldn't see it myself. And when I finally latched onto it and I started to identify, why does that feel so static? Because that branch is misplaced, it changed my styling. Not only in a cascade, also in a semi-cascade, also in the informal upright, where you've got this branch that's dropping down, and you've got this counterbalance branch here, and they form this clean diagonal line. Just by taking a piece of that and breaking that diagonal line, changed everything about styling a tree.
So Christopher had a question about foliage and strength. So when we say that the strength resides in the foliage for junipers and in the roots for pines, is it that the sugars and starches are stored in those places for those species?
Absolutely, because when you look at the structure of the roots in junipers, they're fine. Even when you have a woody root, only a portion of that is alive generally. The core of that is going to be solid heartwood, pink, or purple, resin injected, and not a storing device. Whereas in pines, that coarse tissue is all real fleshy white storage. That storage is what gives them the strength. You're exactly right. Okay, I'm gonna try to push this piece in, but I don't wanna cut this off. I'd originally thought maybe I cut this off. I think this goes in, but definitely not off, okay? So when I go in with it, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take it. If I wanna shorten this, I have two options. I can bring it forward or I can bring it back and then forward. I'm gonna take it back and then I'm gonna bring it forward again. Okay, take it away, now come back. Okay, and then I'll adjust this. And then let me change that elevation just a little bit, just to give some division to that foliar mass. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna boost this up. Change that separation pattern there. I'm gonna boost this up into here even more. I'm gonna get this involved in this sort of vulgar display of this line of this branch and start to close the gap. Now, Moon asked a question a while back. Why does the apex feel so flat? The apex felt so flat not because the apex is too flat. The apex felt so flat because you could see that clear division right there. And when we're doing this, I don't want to show that totality of that line, but we've identified that this branch is definitely necessary. The way that we compensate is we cut that line with foliage from this branch here to engage with that, and lo and behold, it improves the shape of this piece here as well to start to incorporate a little bit more of that connective piece between this and the apical region.
That was Kim, not Moon. But
Kim, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Kim. Moon always asks really pretty insightful questions, so
yeah.
I thought that was a good one, but I've got a few pieces in the apex that are gonna help with that flat feeling, but I am liking what's happening here. How you feeling, Troy?
I'm liking it. That's verdant.
Huh?
The verdant.
The verdict?
Verdant for the Phoenician junipers.
Oh, the verdant?
Yeah, Verdon Gorge.
Verdon Gorge. V-E-R?
V-E-R-D-O-N.
V-E-R-D-O-N. So if you guys want to see those really unique cascading forms of the Phoenician junipers, Verdon Gorge in France, V-E-R-D-O-N. Check those out. You're going to have to dig a little bit because the Phoenicians aren't necessarily the focus of that area. It's more like a recreational area, but they are a big part of what makes it special.
Eric wants to know if we can get some insights about patience from Troy. Insights about patience.
He's basically asking you to tell him how hard it is to work with me.
You can come use the microphone if you'd like.
Oh boy.
Troy would like to pass.
Respectfully,
He has pleaded the fifth.
respectfully plead the fifth. I would like to respectfully not say anything. You're pleading the fifth a lot more these days.
Joshua says the pass is the insight, which I believe.
Testing our patience.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Who's testing your patience?
Troy is by saying I'll pass.
Oh yeah.
He's giving us a trial to pass.
This is the teacher teaching right here.
Exactly. Multiple folks in the chat say, "Well played, Troy."
Oh, well executed, sir. Yeah, I mean, it's a cascading form, right? So Troy, just because you guys can't hear him, he was asking me about a really unique tree that we have, and it's an upright juniper that has a cascading branch. And he said, how would I quantify that sort of style of tree? And I would still, when you have that cascading branch, it does sort of start to meet the formation of that branch in cascade has that acute angle. You know, we've never studio shot that tree. We need to do that. That's a real special one. But with the upright form and the cascade, how do you quantify it? In my mind, it's still a cascade, right? What's the element that gives that tree value? The cascading form. In my mind, this could be. I don't know if it trumps the top, but it's a discussion of how that shape is occurring, and it definitely is dropping below the container, showing that element, right? Okay. So now that that's there, the last big piece is this kind of thing right here. Let's see what we can do here. See if we can pull this in. Start to hide that. And drop this down a little bit more. Drop this down a little bit more. Get that insinuation coming back here. Let's pull this up a little bit more.
Jerry says it's still kind of flat. Looks like there might be too much foliage.
No, it's not too much foliage because I need that length. But the first picture when this was photographed for the website where it looks less flat was just a play on this back piece having been that high point. So I took this piece off of the back, which would make it look a lot rounder because structurally it wasn't sustainable, but I was fooling you guys in that original studio shot. And now that I've made the commitment to passing the energy to these smaller interior shoots, it'll be another year or two because I've got small shoots, and I'll rotate this around so you can see it, but it's gonna be flat tonight. And ultimately, when you start to, again, this second iteration is where we get rid of a lot of that superficial sort of moves towards aesthetic. But in the next 2 years, based on the decisions that we're making tonight, this tree is gonna far surpass its original aesthetic based on that structure becoming the priority of a lot of our decision making and in our moves. I feel good about this, but it is always a little bit sad to see some of those pieces go. And I bet I have just a little bit of something left in the tank tonight.
Leonard asks if you could reduce the tuft on the right to give dimension.
I could, but then I would be sacrificing the commitment to the design direction of tension. If I reduce this, then I'm going to pull the apex back a little bit. And I can look at it. We can take a look at it together. Let me just play a little bit more. This is all this part of the design is all about sort of finalizing a lot of these pieces. If apexes were super easy to style, then nobody would struggle with them. They are a challenge. This is a big part of it. So if that goes there it is. Found it. I've been struggling with this for a while. How are we doing on time?
We are 20 minutes past 8.
Sorry guys.
Thomas wants to know, if you were to sell this tree, how would you base your price?
That
might be a complicated question for tonight, but
what are you trying to do to me, Thomas? If we were to sell this tree, how would we base our price? We would base a tree like this is a very rare tree to find a ponderosa this adapted towards the cascading form. Let me see what we got here. Okay, so we've gotten a little bit of roundness. It is still a little offset. Let's see here. We need that length. I'm going to commit to this. I like this. So let me go ahead and figure out how I pull these two together. So I would be basing my decisions in terms of value on what makes this tree particularly special. And inside of what makes it particularly special, are there others like it? Could you find because there's a lot of great ponderosas. What makes a ponderosa valuable is the fact that it is a sort of one of a kind. And I've never seen another tree more appropriate for a cascading form than this tree. Particularly from the deadwood, from the age that we talked about with that sort of preservative quality of the deadwood, the hollow trunk, the base, the root that was a problem and has now become a feature. These are all big components of sort of determining value in a tree like this. But I would say just the fact that you don't see that many pure cascades as ponderosa or ponderosa pine that are pure cascades makes this tree very, very special. And then you'd say, is anybody actually going to pay for a pure cascade? The more we know about them, the more valuable they become. Maybe someday.
Everybody's excited about what you're doing. Leonard says you did exactly what he asked. Bill said that was the move for the apex.
That was the move, right?
Yes.
Took it away from that sort of flat UFO. Gave us a little bit more, although structurally it's far better. It's going to take it a minute to kind of grow out and mature into that, particularly because this is just a cut bud. And the more that we remove at this point, the more we're going to lose. And then if I shorten here, right, just talking about if I shorten here, notice how the apex starts to shift back that way. It's almost like we remove that commitment to that defining branch and everything coming in this direction. This is where I've just got to kind of accept the fact that this is the limitation of this current iteration. A big part of boosting this tree's sort of length and allowing it to mature was to build an apical region that in that studio photo is only 3 shoots that we represented the apex with. Now we've got that whole canopy. Actually, I'm going to take that back. This thing can go. This can go.
Yeah, Rafi says he thinks that the second level of pads is too broad for a feminine design.
There we go. That helped a lot. That helped a whole lot.
Yeah, look at that.
There it is.
I love how much more of that little bit of deadwood we can see.
Right? And you get this beautiful turn that's kind of highlighted by the apex, so you get to engage with that. And then I want to rotate it just so that that branch is slightly off of that base so that you guys can appreciate that. Man, that is a tree. So I see where Rafi's talking. He's saying right here looks very heavy. Let's see what we can do about that, because we did lose some of the negative space. And that's easy. That's easy to get back because a lot of this was lost. So when we start to see this, I can pull this branch back for depth here. I think that's a keen observation. And then this was one of the areas where we haven't really dug into with a great degree whether this is too long or not. I'm curious what they think on the stream.
Well, we've got some thoughts. People want to know, is the apex pushing right or is it pushing left?
It's pushing left, but just bear in mind that this is still elongating. And let me go ahead and rotate. Let me show you guys the structure of this apex. Jesus, go ahead and focus on these little shoots in here, as well as sort of this little area right here. Okay, are we there, Josh? So we've got this little piece here that's going to be very, very big next year, okay? And that's going to start to fill in this central area. But the big two that we have here are these 2 little shoots right in here that are growing up, that are going to give body to that apex right here and create that high point in this region that's really going to give that definitive move to the left. So we've got to let those. We know we've been building it. Now we've got them. We've got to let them take that next step. And with the transition of a lot of the energy, they're going to take over as that apical region. We're at a point where we almost have some neutrality in the apical region. I'm cool with it being neutral based on the structure we've been able to achieve. When that high point moves farther to the left, we're going to have a definitive length and high point shift that's going to give that tension design back to the left. But I love this line. Oh, and then the last thing again. So where it feels heavy in here, does the reduction of this start to reduce some of that weight.
Ooh.
Let me.
Lots of yes.
Pretty heavy. Cool. All right. So let me take out some of the length. I'm going to take out the length. I'm not going to fully kill off this branch because I've got some super, super sweet interior pieces that I'm developing. Let me show you guys that before we cut out. Okay, so where I just reduced, I just, are we in there, Josh? We are now? Okay, so I've got a little tiny bud on this side. I've got this branch on this side. I just cut that shoot to keep those older needles, but look at what I have in here. Look at these little gems. Mmm, yummy. And then I've got this shoot right here, but I've also got two shoots, one here and one here on that branch. I've got a lot that's going to evolve here over the next 2 years with the transition of this strength, okay? So I think we're as far as we can take it tonight, and I am really, really happy with where we're at. I think we've regained that cascading form proportionally. We've regained the tree, and just before we cut out, let me show you what we took off. There's a lot of needles, but let me just kind of show you the
Whoa.
Can you show us the before, Josh?
There we go. Yes.
All right.
Wow. What a change.
All right. Yeah, and let me get my ugly mug out of the way. Okay, now come back and show us that current. Woo! Holy moly.
Wow.
Holy moly. A tree reborn.
Wow.
Very good. Any further questions?
No, we are good for tonight.
Nice.
Stunning.
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 Yeah, this is a very special tree. This is a really special tree. All right. Thank you guys for sticking with us. The questions tonight, best of any stream yet. Absolutely. The discussion of hormones, auxins, the cascading form. What about these things we've seen? How does this make sense? This is where we've got to be. The idea of putting two rocks together. I mean, I know that a lot of what we preach is, or not preach, but a lot of what I'm educating you guys about does fly in the face of a lot of what we've heard and been told, but I enjoy and appreciate your open-mindedness and your willingness to ask the questions that allow us to get to that deeper level where it's not just based on what I think or want you to know, it's based on actually going through the process and looking at the physiology and being willing to discard the information that we've heard that may not be actually based on anything at all. And I think the proof is always in the pudding. Right, and I'm continuing to be sort of optimistically surprised by what these trees are capable of. You guys are driving a lot of that to happen and continuing to motivate us, being a part of this, helping the growth happen. So thank you very much. Very exciting to hopefully invigorate some of your passion for the cascading form. I invite you and really challenge you guys to try and create this in a way that does it justice. It's an amazing style for bonsai, and I hope you got something out of tonight. Anyways, we'll see you guys on Thursday, 10 a.m. For the Q&A. Check out the beginner series selection of material. We've got some other exciting stuff happening, and next week, Literati repotting and the Jonathan Cross film launch. Don't miss it. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate the support. Have a great week.